leaders, welcome to the Together Project. I'm Kadi Cole, and if you're here, it's because you believe that real leadership means making room for everyone at the table. This season, we are sitting down with church leaders and innovative teams who are doing just that, breaking barriers, challenging assumptions, and shaping a healthier path for men and women to lead in ministry together. So if you're passionate about what it means to lead with authenticity, to make space for different voices, and to create a future where everyone can thrive, then you are in the right place. And if you believe in what we are doing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the podcast and write a review. Reviews really help the algorithm suggest our podcast to more people. You can also follow me on social media at Kadi Cole, that's spelled Kadicole, and visit kadicole.com to sign up for my monthly newsletter and find all the other resources we have on the topic of developing female leaders. Because as Christians, we know that the future isn't male or female. The future is together. Let's dive in. Hey leaders, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm excited to introduce to you my friend and fellow author, Steve Cuss. He wrote the book, Managing Leadership Anxiety, and it is one of my favorites. He's also the creator of Capable Life. I know you're going to gain a lot from his insights. He started his ministry career as a chaplain. He speaks a lot about that, where he really learned about how to deal with unusual situations and tension. And then he talks about how we can navigate that as leaders in ministry, particularly around this issue of developing female leaders. It is a charged issue, and he gives us some great tips and advice about how we can lead better through that tension. He also talks about his experience coming to the United States and realizing this was kind of a thing, what he's done as a senior pastor to make space for women, and some of the work that he's doing now to advocate for female leaders. I think you're really going to enjoy our conversation today with Steve Cuss. Steve, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's really great to spend time with you. We've been friends for a few years now since both our books came out, and I'm a huge fan of your work and really appreciate you taking the time today to be with us.
Yeah, thanks, Kadi. The feeling is totally mutual. I've got 2 or 3 people that I send a lot of people their way, and yours is one of them. I think you're the leading voice on the very thing we're going to be getting into today.
Thank you. And same with you, a lot of mutual respect. So I want to jump in like I do with most of our guests and get a sense from you of how you grew up in the topic of gender. So tell us a little bit about the context you grew up in, and when you as a pastor and a Christian and as a leader in a variety of settings, how you started to realize this issue about men and women in leadership was a thing that you were going to have to navigate.
Yeah, great question. So I was not raised in the church. I was raised in an Australian family, in many ways a traditional Aussie family. Mum and dad both worked, but then mum did most of the work at home as well. My mum's a registered nurse by trade, but she quit that and joined my dad in a small engine company and became the spare parts manager and bookkeeper. My mum died last year, and it's been amazing to dig back into her life as an adult. And just the admiration for whatever it took, that's what she did. Like, she had no background in spare parts. And so I think for me, I didn't think anything of my family of origin until I was 24. I graduated Bible college, moved to America by this point. Obviously, I've become a believer. And I enrolled in chaplaincy. For those who know my story, that people know that's a huge part of my own transformation as a human was chaplaincy. Typically, the way I talk about it is just being in the room with that much death tends to shape you. But as it relates to what you're asking, I had a peer group of 6 chaplain residents, 3 men and 3 women, and 2 supervisors, and we met every morning for 90 minutes. So whether we did a 9-hour shift or a 28-hour shift, we would all gather for 90 minutes every morning in this functionally like a group therapy. It's how we survived chaplaincy. It's how I learned so much of what I teach now. And 2 poignant stories. I am part of a movement that is quite strict on baptism. And particularly in the 1990s, we were very strict on what we believed about baptism. And in the hospital, if a baby was stillborn, we would baptize that baby. And it had more to do with the nurses needing a grief ceremony than any spiritual thing. But I was so wrapped up as a young Bible college graduate in wrong theology that I was not present when I would be baptized. It was my worst fear. Out of everything in chaplaincy, my worst fear was, I'm going to have to baptize a dead baby. What are my Bible college professors going to think?
Mm.
Crazy. I look back now. And so I would walk into the room and I'd have one professor on one shoulder and one on the other, like judging me. And it's actually where I developed the idea of giants on your shoulders. And just as a little aside, what's fascinating is I turn these college professors into judges, but in real life, they would probably be quite empathic
Mm.
to my situation. So,
Mm.
2 a.m, I baptize this dead baby. I'm not present at all to this poor family. I'm just so wrapped up in that I'm violating my core theology. And the next morning, I'm debriefing with my peer group, and Allison, this Southern Baptist fireball of a woman, this mum, who I was like kid brother to her, she unleashes her anger on me. I'm just sharing my vulnerability. Oh man, guys, I had to do this. This is terrible. It's not right theology. And Allison basically says to me, is really, I'll never forget this, Katie. She says, I had a stillborn once. Do you want to know the baptism that I got to do with my stillborn? And I said, yes, I'd love to. And she held out her hand and acted like she had a brown paper bag. And she said, the nurse gave me a brown paper bag and it was just putting the baby in the bag. And she was red hot angry and crying. And then I was crying. And it was the first time in my life I had realized, holy smokes, women have an experience that I know nothing about. My
Mm.
certainty of my own theology has infected my ability to connect human to human. It was profound for me. In that era, it wasn't connected to that event, but we all had to share our family of origin. And in that era, it would have been within weeks or months of that encounter, my peer group and my supervisors were pointing out, as I'm talking about my dad and my uncle and my grandfather and these heroes in my life. And they're like, what about the women? Like, look at all these women. Because when you do your family of origin, it's called a genogram, you actually map your family and put them on a big piece of paper on the wall. And so I've got all these women in my family, my sister who led me to Christ. And they said, you've been telling stories for 45 minutes. You don't talk about the women. And I'm like, what? What? Oh, well,
Mm.
of course. And I start talking about my mom and her humor and my sister and how proud I am. And they said, yeah, I don't know that women really have a voice in your family. And that was profound for me. Blind spot knowledge is a heck of a thing. You have to be really humble because you feel so exposed. When people see something about you, you don't see about yourself.
Mm.
Your ability to then take it and say, okay, this is not a threat. This is a gift. I don't know. I'd be interested how the chaplains, if they were on this pod, they might say, Steve was very combative or defensive. But I don't remember my reaction. I just remember long term, it was transformative. So I then went from chaplaincy to seminary and went to a moderate Christian church seminary and really dug into the theology and the New Testament of women and men in leadership. So that's a lot and very personal, but that's a
Wow.
lot of my journey.
Very interesting. So, as you've gone through your chaplaincy experiences, now you're in seminary, now you're leading a church. Did you start to bump into this issue around women in leadership in church ministry? Was this the first time you thought about that?
I think I had thought about it in college. In the church where I was in youth group, the women were very powerful leaders and impacts on my life, but I had not thought about the system. And I think that's the difference. And then, I had moved from a simplistic approach to the scripture. Paul very directly says, I do not permit a woman to have authority over a man. But any questions? There's no room in that phrase. Seminary was the first time I think I had the freedom to say, is that cultural? Is that
Mm.
eternal? There are certainly things that I treat as cultural. Is this one of them? And then to realize all of the women that Paul co-labored with. I think people can dismiss the Old Testament, which I think is a big mistake, but I understand why you say Deborah was the Old Testament and now we have Jesus. But you look at the list of women that Paul talks about as co-laborers. He called Junia a fellow. She did time with him. So seminary for me was also like, I'm not getting the full story here. I'm a Bible guy to this day. I'm a Bible guy. Seminary was the beginning for me of I'm not reading the Bible the way God intends. And
Mm.
then in my church experiences, it's complicated because powerful women led, but they were called director instead of pastor. Some of these weird hacks that we all make. And then very recently, in the last 10 years, examining what I think is now the infamous Billy Graham rule that's a late journey for me. So I definitely graduated seminary in 2001 thinking, okay, I've got this matter resolved. And then it just every 5 years or so, I keep running into just the assumptions that I hold that need to be examined. And it is the women in my life that teach me the most about it. Like the last 18 years when I've been a lead pastor, it's the female pastors and elders that we have in our church that have educated me. And it's because we're friends and we have a good relationship. So yeah, it's been a lot. It's been an interesting journey for sure.
So you've led as a senior pastor in an egalitarian church setting and still running into these types of situations.
So in seminary, I was a part-time youth minister. I then graduated as an associate pastor at a megachurch in Las Vegas, Central Christian Church, quite a well-known church. Men and women in leadership there. And then when I became a lead pastor in 2005, I brought into this independent Christian church, traditionally a male-only leadership. I brought in and said, hey, if you're hiring me, this is what I'm bringing. And this particular church was very interested in doing a study. We did a 1.5-year journey together. And I said to them, this is not like a quitting, this is not a life and death thing for me, but it is something I'm passionate about. I'd like us to look at it together. They were already very much that way. And we came out of that convinced that the biblical model is men and women elders, men and women pastors. And I'm proud to say my final couple of years as a pastor, my chair of the elders was a woman, my vice chair was a woman. We really did make sure, but we made a lot of mistakes on the way when we thought we had landed. And it would be something, Katie, like, okay, we have 6 elders and 1 is a woman. And we never said, let's have a token woman. We never would, we would be quite put off by that. But that is what happened. And I do think it took a while for us to realize that is not serving our men and women well when there's such a minority in the room. That poor woman is working so much harder to be herself without allies in the room. So we probably 2015, so that was 2005. I bet it was 10 years before we learned, okay, what does it look like to be some form of 50-50 either way? It doesn't have to be 50-50 men and women. If it's 60-40, it could go either way. But to have a collection of men and women together, that really, I think, is where we landed.
What would you say were some of the most helpful things in finding women who were higher level leadership qualities? Because one of the challenges a lot of male pastors have is they're like, we'd love to put a woman on whatever our highest level that we would want women in. The executive team, maybe it's a pastoral or a ministry team. It might be an elder board. What sort of challenges did you face, or how did you overcome just finding the right women to serve in those roles to get those kind of ratios?
That's a great question. I think I have a lot of weaknesses, but one of my strengths is leadership development. I love seeing leaders activated. It's good for my ego. I would rather be the kingmaker than the king, if that makes sense. And even in my shadow side, I think I get my kicks out of saying, look what I helped create. And then I think I'm also good at not just casting a vision for development, but building a path. A lot of my managing leadership anxiety work is a leadership development path. So we never had that problem. I'll just say our church was full of exceptional women who had already proven themselves in and outside the church. In our church, they'd proven themselves, and in the marketplace, they were world-class leaders. So for us, that was never a problem. And I guess I'm always worried about generalizations. I would boldly claim that I don't know many churches that actually functionally have a problem of not having gifted and talented women. I just can't think of a situation. So I'm thinking of a couple in particular. One of our early elders was one of Sprint's leading sales people and sales managers. One of our early elders ran human resources for hundreds of employees. And then one of them just graduated with a master's in social work and came from an education background. Problem there. So that wasn't an issue for us finding competent women. I would really wonder what's going on in your church if you can't find women that are rolling up their sleeves and getting it done. But it also probably raises the question for me, church leadership has always been blue collar. I tend to be suspicious of white collar leadership in the church. So my tendency is if you have an idea, here's how you should do it, Steve. which happens a lot. But you're not rolling up your sleeves and joining me at 7 a.m. with my people. I don't care about your idea.
Mm-hmm.
So we tended to attract more get it done type leaders.
That's what you mean by blue collar, like people who were in the trenches on the front line doing the actual ministry alongside you.
Even if in the workplace they're sitting behind a desk and advising, but we are in a high-tech, high-educated area in our part of the country. And we did have a lot of people that get paid a lot of money to tell others what to do, and they never do it. And they would bring that attitude into the church, and they never found a way to really lead in our church. Our best leaders were always, I've got an idea and I would love to be part of the solution. And then I'm like, let's go. And I'll be patient as you figure it out and make mistakes. Even if I'm listening to their idea and I'm thinking, oh, you have no idea the complexity. The fact that you're willing, let's go. And we would resource them with people and money. And so that helped a lot, I think.
Yeah. And most of your examples are women who had success in the marketplace, and you identified them and brought them into ministry leadership, also bringing those skill sets into the ministry side.
Most of those women, yes, were successful in the marketplace. Even women that stayed at home and raised kids, very great at that. I can't think of many who weren't already proven in our church. They were just always showing up. A couple of these women coming to us saying, we want to start a women's ministry. Let's go. And then next thing, there's 60 women coming to their thing, and it's incredible. And we generally would cast vision, invite people to join it, and watch those who took more ownership than we asked them to, and then say to them, hey, you seem to have a real passion. Let's go. That was generally it.
I love that. And I think you even mentioned having just blinders on around even the women in your own life. I think your story shows how that shifted for you, that you could see women and their contribution to the church and be able to put them into ministry leadership. And that generally is my experience when I work with churches on this topic. There are a lot of women around, sometimes either individually as leaders or culturally as a leadership team. We just gloss over them or don't quite acknowledge their contribution, or we're like, yeah, that's a big women's ministry, but it's actually difficult because they don't work in our systems and they've got 3 times as many people as the men's ministry and we're not sure what to do with them. Instead of recognizing that as, oh, there are some powerful leaders there that they could rally that many women so quickly. Maybe we should use them in a lot of other different ways in leadership as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm always thinking about, if my congregation is listening to my interviews, what would their counter testimony be? And I know, for example, some of our early women's ministry leaders would say, Steve was not always as willing to let us do announcements as we wanted. And I was always saying, honestly, ladies, you don't need to sell women on gathering. The women's ministry just needed a lot less help, whereas the men's ministry tended to, come on, fellas, we can do this.
Please show up, guys. Let's go.
Yeah, it's true. And so I also think some of especially our early leaders in women's ministry probably would have a word about what I'm saying right now, about saying, oh man, we were marginalized. And it's tricky. It raises a question that's probably beyond the scope of what we're talking about. But in the same way, I was always overselling evangelism versus discipleship. Most Christians don't need to be sold on growing in their faith. And so I never believed in democracy when it came to church horsepower and attention. And so our women's team might be thinking, I don't know how I feel about what he's saying.
That's one of the things I actually work with women as they move up in leadership, is you do have to shift your mindset to that executive global perspective, which isn't always everyone gets equal footing in the program or on the platform. There's strategy behind that. And you have to understand the bigger vision of the church in order to understand why we make the choices we do. So it's a good point. I do want to get to your expertise, though, because you've written one of my favorite books for leadership. It's in my top 5 recommendations that I give all the time for leaders, which is the book Leadership Anxiety. And since then, you've produced more work. You have a really great podcast. You have online trainings. A lot of my colleagues in ministry leadership are embracing you as a consultant and working through your process. So I'm a big fan of all that you talk about in that. And I do want to spend a little time on this because I think your perspective for us as leaders, as we navigate a topic that is so emotionally charged, it's hard to really, for me at least, think of another topic, maybe politics, that has as much emotion involved in a church community. And many leaders, particularly male leaders at the senior or executive level or on the elder board, There are a lot of men that I talk to who want to lean into this, or they know it's important, or they can see the dynamics in their church shifting, or their wife has great leadership and they're trying to figure out how to make space for her. Or the number one topic tends to be having a young adult daughter who's emerging from college or seminary, and she's thinking of going to someone else's church to work.
Yeah.
And there, for whatever reason, God is stirring them and pushing them on this topic. But it is a minefield. It's historically a challenging topic. It stirs up a lot of anxiety in us as leaders, in other people who are impacted by it, and a communal anxiety. So talk to us a little bit about why this topic has so much anxiety, and maybe how do we even identify if we have emotional anxiety about this, and what we as leaders can do to navigate that better as we lead.
That's great. It's a great question. There's all kinds of anxieties, and I'm really good at one. And there's so many anxieties I can't help with, depression or trauma even. But leadership anxiety is what I call, clinically, it's called chronic anxiety. And it's fascinating for a Christian because it's always based on an assumption or something that's false. So I'm sure all of us have been in a relationship where we make assumptions about the relationship that are wrong, and that assumption has kept us anxious. The simple example might be if you have a conversation with someone and they walk away and your brain is still going. You're like, oh, what are they thinking? I should have said it differently. That's a simple example of chronic anxiety. So one of our assumptions, I think, that all leaders, we carry so much internal pressure to do it right. And I really have a great empathy for lead pastors that are just carrying so much internal pressure, more pressure than God has asked us to carry, I might say. Mm-hmm. And we all feel a little maxed out. And the men and women discussion feels huge. And we never feel like we have enough energy to manage whatever huge initiatives. And so it's easy just to say, just never mind. But what happens is we attach so much certainty to our theology because we're afraid of getting it wrong. We're very earnest about our theology, mm-hmm. and I understand why. But the topic of men and women is absolutely a non-essential in the Nicene Creed. When you look at the essentials of our faith, the virgin birth, the resurrection of Christ, everyone comes through Jesus, those are the essentials. And then there's all of these non-essentials, and it doesn't take even a simple reading of the scripture to realize that Paul seems to say two contrary things in his teachings. And one is women can never lead men. And the other is, look at all of these women leading men. And so we really do have to test our assumptions. And the number one powerhouse in managing anxiety is curiosity. And so if we go back to that incident where Allison unloaded on me, it was not comfortable, but she gave me the gift of her anger. She did not filter how hurt she was by my naivete. She just gave it to me as a gift. I'll say, Katie, as a white man, I've been in rooms with African Americans who've given me that gift. And I appreciate it. Where they're like, you have the privilege of not having to be outraged about this thing.
That's right.
It's been a gift for me. So when Allison's given me the gift of her outrage or her, let's call it an anxious response, I, as a white man, am prone to say, oh, she's getting all emotional. That's an assumption. Rather than saying, I'm going to be curious about what's going on between me and her, what's going on in her, what have I done that might be wrong? And just that curiosity deepens my ability to connect to her long enough to say, I want to hear more about what's going on. Obviously, something's happened here. Now, it's very rare that you can do it in the moment. Usually, when someone's unloading on you, you're just trying to survive. Come back the next day or the next week and say to that person, I don't like the way I responded to you, and I would like to try again. You were trying to tell me something. Could you tell me again? And would you please push past my reaction? Would you be willing to put up with what I can't control my reaction? But I do think that most strong leaders, most type A, get it done leaders, we tend to shut people down. It's the shadow side of our get it done kind of, and that's me. I'm a bold personality. I tend to have an aggressive approach. And so a lot of the women in my life, and frankly, some of the men, have had to learn to get past that initial response. But it certainly helps them when I'm getting past it and saying, let's do that again. What are you trying to tell me that I couldn't hear? Just curiosity. So if you can approach the scripture with curiosity, and if you can approach the women, where it gets tricky, Katie, is if over the years you have built a system that shuts down their voices, one conversation is not going to do it. I was talking to some wonderful Lencioni coaches recently, and we were talking about how Lencioni's big brand is vulnerability, where they go in and they tell these CEOs, we all need to be vulnerable. And I said to them, I said, hey, you just need to pay attention that if the CEO has set a culture that is not safe, one day of consulting with a Lencioni coach is not going to, those people, their radar is still no way. So there might have to be deeper work, deeper repair that you have to do. But paying attention, being curious about your reaction, what you're measuring is your overreaction. If you're stamping it out, or if you're shutting down internally, you're looking at your own body's reaction. Maybe your heart starts racing. Maybe you start to worry, your brain starts spinning. But curiosity, a lot of times when people listen to episodes like this, I get it. They're thinking, okay, the next meeting, we're going to do this. But I'm always coaching people to say, no, the next year, the next 20 meetings, you're chipping away at it. And that gives you permission to do it badly. So in the next meeting, you can say, I would like us all to spend a year. This isn't all we're going to talk about, but every meeting, we're going to talk about it a little bit. And I am going to do my best to learn from you. How have you experienced me? How have you experienced challenge in this organization? And the hardest thing, Katie, is when some of the women say, it's all great, because that's how unsafe they feel to say, okay, this is what's really going on here. And then I know I'm talking a lot here, but the simplest thing you can do as a leader is save yourself the hassle and just believe people. Just don't, like, most of us have a filter. And as we're hearing people, we're saying, is that true? And we're filtering their experience through our belief. If you as a leader can actually, and you can train your mind to do this, actually say, no matter what you say and no matter how you say it, I'm going to believe you. You will get further. So let me stop there, because that was a lot.
It's such a great background to it, and I think describes really clearly some of the things that we experience as leaders. And I think even just acknowledging one of the reasons I might be avoiding this topic, or I've delayed really conquering this, is not a theological thing. It's not a cost, like I'm going to lose people in the church. I personally experience so much anxiety when I think about this topic, and and it might be that those things might cost me, and the fear of that. But I think you're challenging us as leaders to really be curious even about our own anxiety. Why is it that this leadership topic versus the other 90 decisions I make every week, why is this one, why am I stuck on it? Why is it hard for me? Who are those giants on my shoulders from my past that I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint or do something wrong? And really exploring our own relationship with this topic and where that comes from. So a couple of follow-up questions, and I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit, but you opened a couple doors for me that I think are some of the unspokens around this topic that are confusing to people. So one of them that you talked about was women who have broken through the glass ceiling, so to speak. In the church world, we call it the stained glass ceiling.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, even in churches that don't have a lot of women in leadership, there's one woman who's broken through, and she's the person to see. We have women. She's doing it, that one person, which is true. That is very positive. But that doesn't really mean that we've done great if we can point to one woman who survived. But I think a lot of the challenge happens with that one woman who's made it that far. Men will ask her, what do you think? Are we tough to take? Is my leadership wrong? And she's, no, I think you're doing great. No,
Right.
I don't know what all these women are complaining about. Talk about that journey as being maybe one of the first people in a minority status, one of the first to break through, or being the only person like yourself on a team. What are some of the dynamics that leaders should be looking out for, or maybe pausing or being more curious about than the one quick answer that everything's fine?
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, so where the rubber hits the road in my training is I teach people how to notice when they're no longer human-sized. When we are exactly human-sized, our capacity to connect with each other goes through the roof. That's how intimacy is built in marriage and precious relationships, but also in teams. Human size means that we've made space to notice God, that there's room in our soul to say, okay, God is with me right now. And then human size means that I can connect to somebody who's difficult for me to connect with. Maybe they trigger me, maybe they drive me crazy, maybe they're very critical or they're heated. So once again, back to me and Allison, she came at me with thunder. But if I was able to stay human sized, that would be okay. And of course I couldn't at the time. I was too young and immature. Now, the opposite of human size is we either get bigger than human size, which is what most type A leaders do when we're anxious. And it's so hard, Katie, because it feels to us in the moment like strength. When we are bigger than human, we feel so strong. So the easiest example of that would be if you've ever been in a small group and someone goes on a political rant. And if you're looking at them, if you're not catching their anxiety, you're like studying them, you're like, they're drunk on their own power right now. Like you can see it. They've lost sight of reality. That's because they're disconnected. They're no longer human size. They are bigger than human. They've pushed out the space where they notice God. And they're no longer connected to you. They're now ranting. That's an exaggerated version of what we sometimes call strong leadership. The other end of the pendulum is smaller than human sized. Still hard to notice God because God is no longer our protection. We are in self-protection. God's no longer our refuge. I am my refuge. And what your average, whether it's a woman or any minority, in a majority culture, if you're the only one of your kind in the room, you are swinging wildly between bigger and smaller. It's very difficult to stay human-sized. And so you're struggling to connect. You're disconnected from yourself. So I talk to a lot of African Americans, for example, and they will say, especially like an African American man, they say, I don't want to bring my outrage because then I'll be dismissed. So I diminish myself and then I go home in shame. Oh, why did I not? And when I hear that, I'm hearing, okay, bigger and smaller. As a general rule, most women, if they're the only one in the room, will show up smaller. And when I heard you say, oh, it's fine, that's an example of being smaller. In the Me Too movement, Charlie Rose was one of the people exposed in the Me Too movement, and he was very confused. He was like, these women were into it. Yes, I did it, but it was mutual. It was consensual. He didn't realize that one way a woman gets smaller is through charm, flattery, laughter. And that woman is just trying to get the HE double hockey sticks out of there. But that man hears that as consent, right? So that's what's going on there. So when you can be a third of the room as people of your kind, half of the room, your chance of being human-sized because you have allies and advocates. You're not representing all women everywhere for all time. That's what I hear a lot with African Americans. They're like, I'm tired of being the black voice. I'm one person, you know. And what I love about this, Katie, is you don't have to feel, if you're a white leader who's strong, you don't have to feel guilty about that. That's the way God made you. All you have to do is be aware of this dynamic. I hosted a retreat a couple of years ago. It was a getaway retreat. We had 26 of us, one African American. And he shows up and I pulled him aside and I said, hey, I'm not going to say this in the whole room. I don't want to, but I just want you to know as the leader of this retreat, I'm aware you're the only black man in the room. I want you to know I'm aware. I see it. If you see me doing anything that is making you uncomfortable, if there's anything I can do where you can be human sized, I'd like to know. And he said to me, and I just interviewed him on my podcast. He shared this on the show. He's just saying that to me, help me be human sized. Like, it's not my fault that I'm a white guy, but I can still notice what's going on and lead in that gear, and it'll change so much for people.
That's fantastic. And I think one of the things for women, and I certainly don't represent all women. So from my own experience, though, and working with a lot of women, depending on where their culture is or how much this topic has been explored, because we have some women who are still in spaces that have a very few women in leadership. There might be one woman and she's the only person, and even her own journey. This was me for a long time. really unaware of this gender dynamic. And so I'm just trying to put my head down and lead and go forward. And so when people are asking me, is there an issue? I'm like, no, I don't have an issue. But I really was ignorant to my own challenges and the resistance I was facing. I diagnosed myself with a lot of leadership weaknesses that actually had nothing to do with me. I can see that now in hindsight. And so a lot of times in those environments, I'm bigger and smaller. You mentioned that, like, at the same time.
That's right.
And the bigness is how I got through leadership. I got to put my big girl panties on. I can go in and lead with the best of them. I can show up strong. I can be decisive. I can be clear. And then at the same time, smaller in the sense that I'm minimizing the challenge of it. I'm minimizing how exhausting it is because I only have my own experience to compare it with, no one else's. And that kind of back and forth can be confusing to the woman, and it can be confusing to the men trying to lead this dynamic. And so that's not every woman, but that is a large number of them, especially if this is a new topic in your community. So I think that's important to notice. And getting more than one woman's opinion. I always am fascinated by this idea, like, we want a woman's perspective on this issue. So they'll call one woman. I'm like, I don't know that I can represent all women. I'm a very unique woman. I really am not the one you should probably even call for that. So just trying to broaden our input resources beyond just a single person helps a lot with that dynamic. What would you say, just in closing, to women who are finding themselves in a place where this is a very anxiety-filled topic, but they want to lean into it with their leaders? What advice or thoughts do you have for them as they begin that conversation?
In my field, the litmus test is you can only, let me do the quote and then I'll explain it. Edward Friedman says, the big misunderstanding of our day is that insight works for people who are unmotivated to change. A lot of leaders, regardless of men and women, we believe insight is the solution. I had just a very small handful of critics. They didn't want my insight. They just wanted to kick me around. And I made the colossal mistake of giving them more explanation. Let me give you more of my heart. So for these women who are in these situations, you have to figure out, does this system want to change? And I think unfortunately, the only way to know is you do have to bring your vulnerability. You don't have to bring it more than once, but so you have to be willing to be a bit hurt. And I do think you have to come to your senior leader and say, here is my experience. I would like it to be different. What's your interest? And try to figure out, does this person want to change? Because the one thing we haven't talked about, Katie, like, I'm not even an egalitarian. I'm technically what's called a mutualist. And it's a lesser known third way, I guess. What we haven't discussed is complementarianism is a legitimate Bible honoring approach to faithful leadership. I personally don't agree with it, but I'm in complementarian spaces all the time. And the people in those spaces are doing good work. So we haven't even covered that there is a fidelity to the Bible that lands on complementarian that adds complication to our whole conversation. But then if you are exhausted with your insight and the people don't want to change, I think your next move is to figure out what you need to do to be well. And that's a longer, more nuanced conversation than this pod, but it looks like, can I stay as I am? Do I have to show up differently? Do I have to change my expectation? Do I need to leave? I would not recommend that dialogue without a few hours with a good trusted coach. But my work, all of my anxiety management, basically the message is you are not ever as stuck as you think you are. Anxiety is always telling us we're stuck. And there are actually a lot of options moving forward. So that would be, I think, my advice to that woman is to start by figuring out, does this system and do these core leaders actually want it to be different?
And what advice, Steve, would you give to a leader, a male leader, probably a senior pastor, executive pastor, elder, who's it's time for us to dive into this? It might not be a theological change. That's not necessarily what I advocate for, but at least a leadership practice or a cultural shift to include more women in their leadership gifts as they lead a community, because there is communal anxiety around this also. Just a couple opening thoughts for them on how to begin that process.
if they're just beginning that process, I do think the good news is whether you're a complementarian, egalitarian, mutualist, there is so much more room for men and women leading at high levels together, regardless of authority, hierarchy, and title. There is still, like, I have a dear friend, one of the pastors I respect the most in Colorado. His person, who I would call an executive pastor, is I think her title is the chief executive officer of the church. She's the CEO of the church, but theologically, she's not a pastor at that church. But no one really cares. They're a complementarian church. She's leading to the full capacity. He's the lead pastor. I would say it is a series of rollouts. You have to have concentric circles of conversations. It has to begin with your core executive team as it is now. If that executive team is all men, then it has to very quickly involve the best leader women you know in your context, inviting them in and asking their help. Like, they are not there to explain. You're there in a submissive posture of, please help us, we need help. And then if I'm looking at, in a quick answer, a rollout to a full congregation, to me, that's 2 to 4 years, honestly. It's slow.
Yeah. It is a slower process than most people think.
It's slow. I think slow is good. I have a whole way of teaching you, how do you pay attention to resistance to change? And then how do you notice if your solutions to change are in fact making it worse? For a lot of leaders, our response to resistance builds more resistance. So I have a whole course that I teach on how do you dissolve resistance, and it's usually counterintuitive. Once you start rolling out, let's say you have decided, hey, we're going to have more women in more public roles, regardless of title and theology. And let's say you start getting some pushback from the congregation. Oftentimes the leader's next response is more vision. And the counterintuitive move is to actually say, to move into more curiosity. And it's probably a bit too nuanced for this interview, but I'm usually, people who are resisting me, I'm looking for their fears and their hopes and what they're protecting. But I'm not calling it fear. No one wants a leader to say, what are you afraid of? Because they'll say nothing. But so I might ask, what's really precious to you? As you're telling me you're concerned about this, there's something precious to you that you're defending. I'd like to know what that is. And then I'm sharing my fear. I use that language. So I might say to someone resisting me, why do we need women if things have been fine all this time? I might say, I'll tell you, I'm afraid. The reason I'm bringing this change is I'm afraid that my daughters and my granddaughters won't have a home in this church. They're gifted. What do we do with our gifted women who were born to lead? And I'm not satisfied, and I'm excited. And so just being vulnerable with my critics or resistors, but then inviting my resistors to share more resistance will lower their resistance. So most leaders, you see this most classically if you see like an old aging congregation and a leader who's full of beans, and the old congregation says, we're bringing you in because we want change. And of course, that's not what they meant. And the young leader starts bringing in change, and then the old saints start resisting. And then the young leader says, well, you don't love God. You should be, and then the young leader gets either kicked out as the scapegoat or quits and demonizes that old saints. I see that every time. And I'm like, that young leader didn't understand how to dissolve resistance. He built a bigger wall than they built. So it's so important when people resist change to try to figure out what are they holding on to that really matters to them, and what of that can you honor? And then how can you give them your fear in a straight way, not in a manipulative way? And how can you then define yourself? I teach differentiation of self. And so a number of times, Katie, not just with men and women, but in our church and in our neighborhood, as we built buildings on our property, and we've done affordable housing initiatives on our property, even with our own neighbors, where we define us, like we get massive resistance and we just define ourselves. We do not try to convince them. So this is a longer term play, but with some leaders, I feel like I'm rambling a bit, but 18 months into my leadership at our church, that's not a very long time to roll out to our church women pastors and elders. For years, we said to our church, you don't have to believe this, but we do as the leaders. And this is not a matter of fellowship. So if you have a different view of women in leadership, you're welcome here. But if you're going to pick it outside, we're going to have a word with you. Like if you are causing a ruckus about it, come talk to us. But that was a way of saying, here's where we have landed as leadership. You as a congregation can land wherever you want. We don't need you to agree, but this is where we're going as a church, and we'll make room for you. That's called differentiation of self. And it's really freed me from having to convince people. Instead of doing that, just define where we're going. So that was a lot there, but that's what I would say.
Well, that's so good. And I think your resources have a lot to offer people as they're embracing this. This is why I wanted you to be on the podcast, is you really have some great tools in terms of working leadership teams and congregations through processes to move collaboratively and to be a healthy congregation, even as you embrace big changes like this topic. And it's such an important one. It's such a popular in the sense that it's a very big topic. Most churches are trying to navigate at least some expansion of their leadership wherever they're at on the theological spectrum. So if people want to get together with you or connect with you more to learn more about how you might be able to help them in that process, what's the best way for people to do that?
Yeah, if they just go to my website, stevecusswords.com, I teach a lot of this stuff on my podcast, and then we have paid courses that they can click through from my website to find those. Of course, my first book covers a lot of this kind of stuff as well. So those would be the best, like free and paid resources that I offer.
Sure. Well, Steve's definitely worth the money to all of you listening. And his book that he mentioned, Leadership Anxiety, is fantastic. So I know you have new works coming out soon. I'll be excited to jump onto those as well. And Steve, thank you so much for your time and wisdom. I really just appreciate your leadership and voice in the kingdom. So thank you so much.
Yeah, great to be with you, Katie. Good to see you again. And what a great conversation.
Thanks for joining us on the Together Project. Check out our free theological cheat sheet or grab a copy of my book, Developing Female Leaders, to learn more about the dynamics of how we can all do a better job creating church cultures where every leader can thrive. You can find those resources and more at kadicole.com. Remember, the future is not just male or female. The future is together. See you next time.